I'd like to continue our brief history of photography by looking at the role of the photographer. What is the photographer's purpose in society? What is it that they do, and how do they enrich our lives? The sheer quantity of images that could be created by photography allowed photographers to capture life and experience literally as it unfolded. Photographers could create a visual record of any time and place, or a passage of time or series of events. The first major event that photographers captured was the American Civil War, and you see evidence of this with Matthew Brady's prints. Around 1900, the technology was invented that allowed for photomechanical reproduction, which was high-speed printing of photographs and type. With that development, photos could be printed in newspapers, and the idea of photojournalism was born. Photojournalism quickly became concerned about more than just getting a picture to illustrate an article. Photojournalists generally create a large body of work centered upon an event, a place, or a culture. During the Great Depression in the United States in the 1930s, a number of tremendous photographers emerged who documented this particularly difficult human experience. People struggled to make it day to day during a period of great turmoil and sadness. Many of you have likely seen this photograph before. This is Dorothea Lange's Migrant Mother, and it was taken in 1936 at the height of the Great Depression. Lange was a photographer who worked for the federal government under Roosevelt's New Deal. Her job was to travel around the country and to photograph daily life and family life of people hit hard by the economic devastation of the Great Depression. What do you notice about this picture? What feelings or emotions do you get? Look carefully. How does Lange use light and shadow to bring your eye to focus on what she thinks is most important? Here's another one of her photographs. This is called Breadline from 1933. What would you say is the focal point of this photo, or the thing that's most important? How does that focal point and her composition of the photograph play up the emotion of the piece? What feelings do you get when you look carefully at this work? Today, we think of documentary photography as capturing important, significant images from our world, current events. These are images that help shape our understanding of major global events. This is a very famous photo from the Vietnam War by Eddie Adams. He was taken in 1968. People say that the Vietnam War was the first one to really play out on television because it was the first armed conflict that featured embedded news reporters. But it was extremely well documented in photographs as well. Looking at this, how do you respond to something like this? For me, I see horror, devastation, man's capacity for evil. All of it is told in just one frame. And that's how effective photojournalism is. You may have seen this photograph as well. This is called Afghanistan, and it's by the photographer Steve McCurry. He's internationally renowned and takes photos for publications like National Geographic. This girl here is a refugee from the war in Afghanistan between Afghanistan and the Soviet Union in the 1980s. A description of this said that her haunted eyes tell of a young Afghan refugee's fears. Can you see that by looking at this? What do you see in this photograph? How do her eyes match the background, and what is the emotion that you feel when you look at this? This last one is by the British photographer Tim Hetherington. He was embedded with American forces during the current war in Afghanistan, and he liked to capture the sort of mundane daily life or day-to-day humdrum experiences of the troops when they weren't actually fighting. What do you see happening here? The sad thing about Tim Hetherington is that he was actually killed in the field while telling the story. So you can understand why photos like these are so important. We have a record of the complete experience of these troops, not just the experience that we see play out on CNN or cable news, or that we hear about in the newspaper or on the radio. Today, we consider photography to be fine art. Museums and galleries have special areas or exhibitions specifically for photography, But that wasn't always the case. It took pioneers of the medium who from the beginning argued that photography could be as freeing as any other art practice, and practiced it as such, to fight for it and bring it up to the level of classical painting and sculpture. Some of these photographers created rules for using photography in visual expression. When it was first developed, people thought that photography most closely resembled painting. So photographers who pioneered the idea that photography could be an art form in and of itself experimented with using light and shadow to take painterly photos. Alfred Stieglitz was an important American photographer who made this idea popular and created some basic rules for photography. He was part of the pictorialist movement, a group of people who sought to undermine the objectivity of photography, the sort of straight-up representation of people and objects that we see in our daily lives, and instead focus on making atmospheric or gauzy, dreamlike images. Here, Stieglitz has photographed the hands of his love interest, the painter Georgia O'Keeffe. You can see that it's blurry, almost out of focus, and mysterious. It has kind of a watery, almost painterly effect. This photographer, Edward Steichen, was a contemporary of Stieglitz and also a member of the pictorialist movement. In this photo, you can see that Steichen has photographed a simple pond, but he's done so in a very painterly way. What do you see in this photo? How does he use light and shadow to enhance the meaning of the piece? As you can see, these early photographers were able to get some really interesting effects from the camera. But Stieglitz, ever the restless artist, quickly grew dissatisfied with pictorialism and decided that in order for photography to really be an art, it had to try to stop acting like painting. It needed to be true to its own form. So he took a step back to straight-up photography. This photograph is one of Stieglitz's that is most closely associated with the idea that photography should be true to itself. He captured this shot while on a ship returning from abroad. He looked down and realized that he had a perfectly composed photo. What do you notice about the composition of this photography when you look at? How do all of the visual elements, things like light and dark and line and shape and form, how do they work together to kind of create a unified image? This type of photography came to be known as pure or straight photography. Pure photographers do very little to manipulate the photo. They visualize the composition in advance and then they take the shot. An American photographer who gained much fame working this way was Ansel Adams, and his work, I'm sure, is familiar to you all. It's Old Faithful. This is a winter sunrise over the Sierra Nevada. Up until the 1960s, even though the technology existed, much serious photography was not shot in color. It was done only in black and white. Serious photographers argued that color film lacked dignity and was suitable only for vulgar commercial or advertising photography. But in the 1960s, those conventions started to crumble, and now today, many photographers work in color. Cindy Sherman is an artist who we'll visit a lot this semester. She's a contemporary artist who uses photography to create images of herself as somebody else or another character. She invents these characters and documents them in a series of photos. Today, too, as digital technology, both digital cameras and computer software like Photoshop and other editing tools are the norm, and many photographers get a little help from the computer. This is an image by David Meisel. Here's one by Thomas Hepker. It's Andy Warhol. And here's one by Jim Goldberg. And as we move through the semester, we'll sort of explore both of these tracks. We'll begin with kind of looking at documentary practice once we get a feel for how composition works and how to take a good picture. And then we'll move on and round out the semester with the idea of artistic photography, narrative, portrait, all the good classical photographic media. So I'm excited, and I hope you are too, and we'll look forward to going on this journey together.